They don't tell you this when you're young, but one of the quietest pains in life is sitting in a crowded room and realizing you have no one you could truly call a friend. Not the kind who laughs with you in photos, not the kind who replies with emojis, but the kind who would notice if your voice sounded different today. And if you're listening to this right now, feeling that familiar heaviness in your chest, wondering what's wrong with you, this story begins exactly where your question lives. Pushpin if you enjoyed this story. Don't forget to like it and subscribe to my channel to read even more exciting stories. There was a man named Aarav who learned early how loud silence could be. He wasn't born lonely. As a child, he laughed easily, trusted quickly, and believed people meant what they said. But life, as it often does, reshaped him slowly, almost politely. School taught him comparison. Teenage years taught him rejection without explanation. Adulthood taught him that being surrounded by people didn't mean being seen. By his late 20s, Aarav had something most people would envy. A stable job, a small apartment with clean windows, and a routine that looked respectable from the outside. Every morning, he woke up at 6:30, brewed coffee strong enough to shock his senses, and sat by the window watching the city rush toward somewhere important. Somewhere that didn't include him. His phone stayed quiet on the table, face down, not because he didn't want distractions, but because he already knew there would be none. At work, he was polite, dependable, and invisible. He listened more than he spoke, smiled at the right moments, and mastered the art of leaving conversations before anyone noticed he had nothing personal to contribute. His co-workers liked him, or at least that's what they said when he was around. But liking someone is not the same as choosing them, and Aarav was rarely chosen. Lunch hours were the hardest. He'd watch groups form naturally, chairs pulled closer, voices lowering as laughter rose. He often ate alone, scrolling through news he didn't care about, pretending he enjoyed the solitude. He told himself it was freedom. He told himself he preferred it this way. But some days, the lie felt heavier than the loneliness. There was one evening, though, that changed the tone of his thoughts. It was raining, not dramatically, just enough to blur the streetlights and make the world feel softer. Aarav stood under a bus stop shelter, soaked at the edges, when a stranger beside him spoke. "Funny thing," the man said, staring at the rain, "how everyone's in such a hurry to get somewhere, but nobody wants to sit with themselves on the way." Aarav nodded without thinking. He didn't know why he did. Maybe because the words felt like they were spoken for him. The man smiled, not expecting a conversation, and that was it. No exchange of names. No follow-up. Just a sentence that lingered longer than most friendships Aarav had known. That night, lying in bed, Aarav stared at the ceiling and asked himself a question he had avoided for years. What if the problem isn't that I have no friends, but that I think having few friends means I'm broken? The question unsettled him. He had built his self-worth on numbers. How many people called, how many remembered his birthday, how many invited him without him asking. Every low number felt like proof. Proof that he was uninteresting. Proof that something about him was defective. He remembered moments he had buried. Times he tried to fit in by becoming smaller. Times he laughed at jokes that hurt him. Times he stayed quiet when he wanted to speak, just to avoid being abandoned. And still, abandonment came, quietly, consistently. Aarav began to notice something uncomfortable but honest. The loneliest moments weren't when he was alone, but when he was with people who made him feel replaceable. The emptiness didn't come from silence, it came from pretending. One weekend, he decided not to attend a colleague's gathering he had been half invited to. Instead, he walked through a nearby park, phone in his pocket, eyes open to things he usually rushed past. Children learning to ride bicycles. An old man feeding birds, smiling at each one like they mattered. A woman sitting alone on a bench, reading, completely unbothered by the world moving around her. Pushpin if you enjoyed this story. Don't forget to like it and subscribe to my channel to read even more exciting stories. For the first time in a long while, Aarav didn't feel like an outsider. He felt like an observer. And there was power in that. He sat on a bench and opened a notebook he carried but rarely used. He didn't write goals or plans. He wrote truths. Uncomfortable ones. Gentle ones. He wrote, "I am not loud, and that doesn't mean I am weak." He wrote, "I feel deeply, even when no one notices." He wrote, "Maybe my life isn't empty, maybe it's just quiet." If this story is already touching something inside you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories that speak to the parts of you words usually miss. Days turned into weeks, and something subtle shifted inside him. Aarav stopped forcing connections. He stopped chasing replies. He stopped measuring his worth by invitations. Instead, he began measuring his days by honesty. Did he live as himself today, or as the version he thought others would accept? But here's the part no one warns you about. When you stop begging for belonging, you begin to stand out, to yourself first. And that can be terrifying. One evening, Aarav received a message from someone he hadn't heard from in months. A casual, "Hey, long time." In the past, his heart would have raced, fingers trembling as he replied instantly, afraid of losing the moment. This time, he paused. He asked himself a new question. Do I want this connection, or do I just fear being alone? He didn't answer right away. And in that pause, something cracked open inside him. A realization he wasn't ready to fully accept yet, but couldn't ignore either. What if having few friends wasn't a curse, but a filter? What if life was quietly removing what didn't fit, preparing space for something deeper? Aarav closed his notebook, stood up from the bench, and walked home under a sky that felt unusually close. He didn't have answers. He didn't suddenly have friends. But he had a feeling, fragile, unfinished, that his loneliness might be trying to teach him something he had spent years running from. And just as he reached his apartment door, phone vibrating softly in his hand, he realized this story wasn't really about being alone at all, but about what happens right before you finally meet yourself. The phone kept vibrating in Aarav's hand, not urgently, not insistently, just enough to remind him that someone, somewhere, had remembered he existed. He stared at the screen without unlocking it, his reflection faintly visible on the dark glass. For a moment, he imagined answering the message, slipping back into the familiar rhythm of polite questions and shallow updates. He imagined the brief warmth of being acknowledged, followed by the quiet disappointment when the conversation faded again. His thumb hovered, then lowered. He put the phone on the table and let the vibration stop on its own. That night, sleep came slowly. His mind replayed old scenes like a film stuck on repeat. The time he waited hours for a reply that never came. The birthday when he bought his own cake and told himself he preferred it that way. The friendships that started intensely and ended without explanation. He realized something painful but clarifying. He had spent years auditioning for roles in other people's lives, never stopping to ask if he even wanted the part. Morning arrived with pale light and a quiet determination he couldn't yet name. Aarav followed his routine, but something inside him was different, less desperate, more observant. At work, he noticed how conversations revolved around complaints, gossip, and competition. He noticed how often people spoke without listening, how laughter sometimes covered insecurity. He didn't judge them, he simply saw them clearly for the first time. During lunch, instead of eating at his desk, he stepped outside. The city felt louder today, sharper. As he walked, he thought about the idea that had unsettled him the night before, that loneliness might be a filter. The thought both comforted and frightened him. If it was true, then the emptiness wasn't proof of failure. But it also meant he couldn't hide behind victimhood anymore. It meant responsibility. That afternoon, his manager asked him to stay back for a project discussion. Aarav listened, nodded, and then, without fully planning to, spoke up. His voice didn't shake, but it surprised even him. He offered an idea he'd been quietly refining for months. The room went silent. For a second, he feared he'd misjudged the moment. Then someone leaned forward. Someone else asked a question. The discussion shifted. Pushpin, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like it and subscribe to my channel to read even more exciting stories. When the meeting ended, a coworker smiled and said, "I didn't know you thought like that." It wasn't admiration or friendship, just recognition. But Aarav felt something loosen in his chest. He hadn't been invisible, he had been quiet. And there was a difference. That evening, instead of scrolling aimlessly, he opened his notebook again. He wrote about the meeting, not with pride, but with curiosity. Why had it felt different? The answer came easily. He hadn't spoken to be liked. He'd spoken because the thought mattered to him. Days passed, and Aarav began experimenting with small acts of honesty. He declined invitations he didn't want to attend. He stopped apologizing for needing time alone. He allowed silences in conversations instead of rushing to fill them. Some people drifted away faster. Others remained exactly the same. And a few, very few, responded differently, as if relieved they no longer had to perform either. One evening, he received a call from his mother. Their conversations were usually brief, practical. This time she asked, "Are you okay?" Not out of concern, but intuition. Aarav hesitated, then answered truthfully, "I'm learning to be." There was a pause on the line. Then she said softly, "That's good. You've always been stronger than you think." The words stayed with him long after the call ended. He realized strength wasn't always about endurance. Sometimes it was about choosing not to abandon yourself just to keep others close. A week later, at the same bus stop where the stranger had spoken to him about sitting with oneself, Aarav noticed a woman standing alone. She wasn't scrolling, wasn't calling anyone, just watching the rain. Something about her calm presence mirrored his own recent shifts. When the bus arrived, they boarded without speaking, standing a few feet apart. As the bus jolted forward, she lost her balance slightly. Aarav instinctively reached out, steadying her arm. "Thanks," she said, meeting his eyes briefly. Her voice was warm but unassuming. He nodded. "No problem. That could have been the end. And in the past, it would have been." But something nudged him, not urgency, not fear, just openness. "This route's always crowded," he said. "Rain does that." She smiled. "Or maybe people just don't like walking alone in the rain." Aarav laughed softly. "Funny thing. Sometimes walking alone is the best part." She studied him for a moment, then said, "I think I agree." They didn't exchange numbers. They didn't promise to meet again. They simply talked, about books, about quiet places in loud cities, about how exhausting it could be to pretend you were someone else all day. When Aarav got off the bus, he felt lighter, not because he'd made a connection, but because he hadn't tried to force one. That night, he realized a subtle truth. Real connection doesn't arrive when you chase it. It arrives when you make room for it. But making room required letting go of old beliefs. The belief that being chosen by many made you valuable. The belief that solitude was a flaw. The belief that having few friends meant something had gone wrong. As these beliefs loosened, something unexpected surfaced. Fear. If he wasn't broken, then what excuse did he have for staying small? If his loneliness wasn't a curse, then what responsibility did he have to live fully? Aarav felt this fear most intensely on quiet weekends. With no distractions, no social obligations, he confronted himself. Who was he, really, without the roles he played for others? The answer wasn't clear yet. But he sensed it forming, like a shape emerging from fog. One Sunday evening, as the city lights flickered on, Aarav sat by his window again. The same view, the same coffee cup, the same silence. Yet it felt entirely different. He picked up his phone, not to check messages, but to scroll through photos he'd never shared. Moments he'd lived quietly. Walks, notes, half smiles. He understood something then, something that unsettled him deeply. The world hadn't ignored him as much as he had ignored himself. And now that he was finally listening, the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was asking something of him. As he closed his eyes, a thought surfaced that made his heart race, not with loneliness, but with anticipation. If this was only the beginning of understanding his solitude, what would happen when he finally stopped fearing it? Aarav didn't sleep much that night. Not because his mind was noisy, but because it was unusually clear. Thoughts came one by one instead of crashing together, and each one carried weight. He kept returning to the same realization. He had spent most of his life waiting to be invited into meaning, never realizing he could build it himself. The next morning, he did something unfamiliar. He left his phone behind. It wasn't a dramatic decision, just an instinctive one. He slipped his notebook into his bag instead and stepped out into the city. Without notifications pulling at his attention, the world felt sharper, closer. The sound of footsteps, the murmur of conversations, the rhythm of traffic, it all felt like a language he was only now learning to understand. He walked for a long time, eventually reaching a quiet cafe tucked between two old buildings. Aarav had passed it dozens of times but never gone in. Today he did. The place was nearly empty. Soft music, warm light, no pressure to perform. He ordered coffee and sat near the window, notebook open, pen resting between his fingers. For the first time, he didn't write about loneliness. He wrote about curiosity. He wrote about the things he'd always wanted to try but postponed because he had no one to do them with. He wrote about ideas he'd dismissed as unrealistic because no one had encouraged them. He wrote about the version of himself that existed only in private moments, the thoughtful one, the creative one, the one who noticed details others missed. As the hours passed, something strange happened. Aarav felt accompanied. Not by another person, but by himself. The ache he used to feel when sitting alone in public places wasn't there. In its place was a steady presence, like finally sitting beside someone who understood your silences. Pushpin, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like it and subscribe to my channel to read even more exciting stories. Later that week, a message arrived from the same person who had texted him days ago. This time, Aarav read it without anxiety. He replied honestly, without over-explaining, without trying to sound interesting. The conversation flowed briefly, then ended naturally. And when it ended, Aarav didn't feel abandoned. He felt complete. That was when he realized how much energy he used to waste holding on to conversations long after they had expired, reviving them, resuscitating them, blaming himself when they faded. Letting things end was not failure. Sometimes it was respect. At work, his behavior continued to change in small but noticeable ways. He didn't force smiles. He didn't agree just to be agreeable. When someone asked how he was, he answered truthfully but simply. "I'm good," meant good. "I'm tired," meant tired. No performance, no drama. Some colleagues found this shift unsettling. A few tried to pull him back into old patterns, gossip, complaints, shallow bonding. Aarav didn't reject them. He just didn't sink into it. And without confrontation, without explanation, distance formed where alignment didn't exist. Yet something else happened too. One afternoon, a coworker named Rohan stopped by his desk. "You always seem calm," he said. "Like you don't need anyone's approval." Aarav smiled slightly. "I used to. I just got tired." Rohan nodded, as if that answer made more sense than anything else. He pulled up a chair. They talked, not about work, not about others, but about pressure, expectations, and the exhaustion of pretending to be fine. It wasn't a friendship yet. It wasn't labeled. But it was real. And that was new. Aarav began to understand that meaningful connections didn't come from availability alone. They came from alignment, from shared honesty, from the courage to show up as you are, even if that meant fewer people stayed. On another rainy evening, he found himself at the bus stop again. He half expected to see the woman from before, but she wasn't there. Strangely, he didn't feel disappointed. He felt grateful, for the conversation they'd had, for the reminder that connection could be light, momentary, and still meaningful. As the bus arrived, Aarav watched his reflection in the glass. He looked the same, yet felt different. Less hollow, less needy, more grounded. That night, he called an old friend he hadn't spoken to in years. Not to rekindle what had faded, but to apologize. Not for something dramatic, just for the version of himself that had been dishonest, that had stayed quiet when he should have spoken, that had expected the other person to fill spaces only he could. The conversation was awkward, gentle, and incomplete, and when it ended, Aarav felt lighter. Because closure didn't require reconciliation. Sometimes it required recognition. Weeks passed. The days didn't suddenly become extraordinary. Aarav still ate alone sometimes. Still spent evenings in silence. Still went entire weekends without social plans. But the story he told himself about those moments had changed. Silence was no longer a verdict. It was a landscape. One evening, while reorganizing his apartment, he found an old journal from years ago. He flipped through pages filled with frustration, longing, and questions written in desperation. On one page, in messy handwriting, he had written, "Why doesn't anyone choose me?" The question hit him hard, not because it was painful now, but because he finally had an answer. Pushpin if you enjoyed this story. Don't forget to like it and subscribe to my channel to read even more exciting stories. He picked up a pen and wrote beneath it, slowly, "Because I didn't choose myself." The realization didn't feel triumphant. It felt sobering. How many years had he given away, believing he needed permission to matter? That night, as he sat by the window again, Aarav noticed something subtle but profound. The city looked the same, but it no longer felt indifferent. It felt open, as if it had been waiting for him to step into it fully. Yet beneath this newfound steadiness, a deeper challenge began to surface. Choosing himself meant redefining success, happiness, and connection. It meant risking disappointment, not from others, but from the parts of himself that still longed to be needed. And as Aarav stood there, aware that something inside him was shifting permanently, a quiet question rose from within, one he wasn't ready to answer yet. If he no longer feared being alone, what kind of life would he now have the courage to live? Aarav didn't wake up one day surrounded by friends, applause, or sudden success. Life didn't reward him instantly for choosing himself. Instead, it offered something far more powerful and far more lasting. Clarity. Clarity that silence was not his enemy. Clarity that depth would always matter more than numbers. Clarity that he was never broken, only misunderstood, especially by himself. He began to live differently, not loudly, not dramatically, but truthfully. His mornings were still quiet, but they no longer felt empty. They felt intentional. He learned to enjoy his coffee without scrolling, his walks without music, his evenings without distraction. In those moments, he discovered something most people spend their entire lives avoiding: their own company. And here is the truth few people are brave enough to admit: if you cannot sit with yourself, no crowd will ever save you. Aarav stopped chasing friendships that required him to shrink. He stopped explaining his depth to people committed to staying shallow. He stopped begging for replies, invitations, validation. Instead, he invested in becoming someone he respected when no one was watching. Something unexpected happened as a result. People began to notice him, not because he tried harder, but because he finally stopped trying. His calm made others curious. His boundaries made others respectful. His presence felt grounded, not desperate. Conversations became fewer, but richer. Connections became rare, but real. And when loneliness did visit, and it still did sometimes, he no longer panicked. He listened. Loneliness wasn't punishing him, it was pointing him inward. It was reminding him that growth often happens in isolation, just like seeds beneath the soil. Aarav realized that most people fear having few friends because society teaches us that popularity equals worth. But popularity has never been proof of meaning. Some of the most influential, creative, and fulfilled people in history walked alone for long stretches of their lives, not because they were rejected, but because they were evolving. He understood now, having few friends doesn't mean you are unlovable. It often means you are selective. It means you refuse to trade authenticity for acceptance. It means your soul demands depth, not noise. One evening, months later, Aarav sat at the same window where his journey had quietly begun. The city lights flickered as always. Cars passed. Lives moved forward. But inside him, there was peace, a steady, unshakable peace. His phone buzzed with a message from someone who truly knew him. Not a crowd. Not a group chat. One person. And that was enough. Because real connection doesn't come in bulk. It comes in truth. If you are listening to this story and you feel unseen, unfriended, left behind, hear this clearly. You are not broken. You are becoming. And becoming often requires solitude. It requires space. It requires courage to walk alone when the wrong company is louder than the right silence. Do not rush to fill the quiet. Let it shape you. Do not measure your worth by how many people choose you. Measure it by how deeply you choose yourself. Do not fear having few friends. Fear losing yourself just to keep many. One day you will look back, like Aarav did, and realize that the seasons of loneliness were not empty chapters. They were training grounds. They taught you strength, discernment, and self-respect. They prepared you for connections that feel safe, honest, and aligned. And when that day comes, you won't beg to be included. You won't fear being alone. You won't question your worth. You will stand firmly in who you are, whole, grounded, unbroken. If this story spoke to you, if it reflected a part of your life or your heart, subscribe to my channel for more powerful stories like this that remind you who you truly are.